Right, shall we record this thing?
Yeah, let's go for it. Let's see what happens. Hopefully,
Okay.
hopefully we don't make fools of ourselves.
Well, if we do, we do.
Welcome to the first episode of A Little Bigger Anarchism with me, Shane Little.
And me, John Bigger.
This first episode, we're going to broadly be talking about an anarchist politics.
And the first part of it is going to be a discussion between the two of us on a kind of broad sweep through British politics, how we got to where we got to, the spectacular nature of British politics, and where it's going to lead us to next, as far as we think, at least.
And then that'll be followed with a discussion we had recently with Ruth Kinna around the idea of an anarchist politics, what an anarchist politics is, what it might be, and avenues to develop an anarchist politics in Britain today.
So if people are listening and they want to get in touch with us, maybe they want to give us some constructive criticism, some help along the way, because this is the start of a conversation, isn't it, rather than the full answer to things. How can people get in touch with us?
Yeah, absolutely. If people want to join in the discussion with us, you can email us on alittlebiggeranarchism@gmail.com.
And that's all one word, a little bigger anarchism.
All one word, @gmail.com. Yeah.
Excellent, fantastic. We should also give a shout out to the Anarchism Research Group.
Absolutely, yeah.
And all of this information is also in the programme notes on the podcast website.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Shall we get on with our discussion on British politics then?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do that. So what we're going to do is have a discussion about British politics, how we got to where we are, and what we think is going to happen in the future once the Tories have decided who's going to be Prime Minister, all 160,000 of them. And I think the financial crisis of 2008 is the logical place to start.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to.
Okay, all right.
Okay, I'm going to start with the 6th of July 2005. Trafalgar Square. Lots of people have gathered for an announcement. Any idea what that announcement is?
25. Jeez, I mean, how old would I be then? I was 20. So I was definitely around, but I don't remember. No.
That was the day that the announcement was made that London would host the 2012 Olympics.
Okay, yeah, I do remember that. Yeah.
It was also the year that Tony Blair won his third general election victory, a historic third term for Labour, New Labour. Michael Howard was the leader of the Conservatives during that election period.
I remember him, yeah.
This feels like a different age already, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't it? And 6 months after that announcement in Trafalgar Square, David Cameron would become the Tory leader. It would be another 2 years before Tony Blair gives in and eventually allows Gordon Brown to become Prime Minister. But the reason I think that that's an important starting point is actually because of the opening ceremony of the Olympics. I'd like to talk about the opening ceremony of the Olympics.
Yeah.
Did you watch the opening ceremony in 2012?
Not live, but I have seen clips of it, and obviously Mr. Bean's sketch comes to mind when he's hearing that one note. I think that's all I really remember from you.
Well, it's really unfair of me because I watched it in the last week before our discussion because I knew I wanted to talk about it. What I really wanted to do was go back to it and revisit it and see what it was like, because I watched it that night, but I hadn't intended to.
Right.
I kind of watched it out of curiosity, thinking the British are going to screw this up. This is going to look terrible. This is just going to be embarrassing. And actually, I think most people came away from watching that opening ceremony thinking it was brilliant.
Yeah.
And it was brilliant because it was nostalgic.
Yeah.
It showed British popular culture although there's only a very brief glimpse, a very brief mention of Doctor Who, which is very distressing to me. Should have been much higher profile. But it showed popular culture of Britain in a nostalgic way. So there's lots of references, EastEnders, The Wind in the Willows, Mr. Bean you've mentioned, there's Monty Python references, Fawlty Towers, there's just lots of, James Bond of course, with that, supposedly the Queen getting a lift with James Bond to the stadium. Lots of different things, and popular culture. There was a sweep through the various musical stages of popular culture in the 20th century, pop music, and it was really, really an enjoyable show. Danny Boyle directed it, produced the whole thing, planned it all out. He was announced about a month into the coalition forming as the artistic director of this thing. But I think the decision was made before the election.
Right.
I don't know, it feels like a more New Labour appointment than a coalition one for some reason.
Sure, yeah.
But I might be wrong on that. But what's interesting about it is it presented a Britain that had already gone.
Yeah.
It was already lost, I think. And there was a particular part of the opening ceremony where they emphasised the NHS and with a dance routine. And during that dance routine, people representing NHS nurses were wearing 1940s outfits. So again, nostalgia was playing heavily. This was an NHS back in the past. And actually, there was a health and social care bill introduced to Parliament in 2011 under, I think Andrew Lansley was the Secretary of State for Health. And that set up the kind of dismantling of the NHS hierarchy, meaning that different parts of the NHS could no longer talk to each other because the lines of command had been broken and nothing had really been put in its place. Really quite important, this, I think, if we're going to end up talking about the pandemic.
Right, okay.
Because those reforms are particularly associated with that coalition government. And basically it made it incredibly difficult to coordinate things during the pandemic. So lots of things were going on around the time of that opening ceremony that I think signify already that Britain was going in a direction that is not great, basically. And so I kind of think, well, where does it place David Cameron? Where do we place him? Is he one of the worst prime ministers ever? The worst prime minister ever? It's quite astonishing when you think of how much has changed since that nostalgic look back in 2012.
Yeah.
Any ideas?
If he was the worst prime minister?
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, not since who's come after him. I would say that's a bit harsh on Cameron. Yeah, I think like if Cameron was in the run-in for the leadership today, he would probably seem like a sensible candidate compared to Sunak and Truss. No, I wouldn't say Cameron was the worst prime minister. But I agree with you that the nostalgia and looking backwards was a big thing. And I even remember in high school having like personal social health education, I think it was called.
Right.
And the big thing then was British values and what British values mean and everything. Yeah. Because it was very much, I think even before that there's kind of this transition of like trying to like put multiculturalism at the forefront of Britishness. People talk about the culture war now, but I remember when I was a kid, that was like a big thing and everything. And, there's no talk of intersectionality or critical race theory and all this nonsense. It was, that was definitely there. And that kind of, even as a kid, kind of feeling like the country was trying to transition into something but couldn't. Yeah, absolutely.
While the opening ceremony was going on, there was an MP, Tory MP called Aidan Burley. Is that a name that rings a bell at all?
No, I can't say it does.
Aidan Burley tweeted that the opening ceremony was left-wing nonsense and multicultural crap.
Right. Okay.
which David Cameron had to criticise him for. The multicultural crap is quite amusing in a way, because how could you do an Olympic opening ceremony without kind of representing different cultures in a way? And there were multicultural elements to it. Certainly the opening ceremony didn't really kind of deal, and I'm not sure that it could deal effectively with the problems of empire, but there were references to that. There was a depiction of the Windrush arriving and people getting off the boat, for example, and it was multicultural in the sense, not just in the sense that it was London hosting the world, but it was multicultural in terms of the people that took part, a cast of thousands from every kind of community in the UK and all of that sort of thing. But his central criticism is a little bit silly on that front. And David Cameron had to criticise him, I think, because, I think probably David Cameron's socially liberal in some ways as well, so he probably disagreed with him. But also, the idea that it was left-wing, I think is actually true. I think Aidan Burley was right.
Okay.
I think the presentation of Britain in that nostalgic way was harking back to the Attlee government when it was talking about the NHS. There was a moment in the dance routines where the people involved, viewed from above, presented the peace symbol. So there's like little references to nuclear disarmament and peace and that sort of movement. So certainly, I would say that there was a left-wing bias to it. However, there's also things like the army and the police and the monarchy and other things being referenced as well. So Aidan Burley was put in his place firmly. He was also actually famous at the time for being sacked by David Cameron from a junior ministerial position because a video had emerged of him at a stag party in the Alps, which had a Nazi theme to it. So he was prominent and notorious already. So he's the kind of person who would have criticised what he was watching. But you mentioned Culture War earlier, and it made me think when I was watching it, what would there have been more tweets? What would Nadine Dorries have thought of this opening ceremony? It was, I imagine there would have been more people like Aidan Burley kicking up a fuss about it if it was happening now.
Yeah, and like that also kind of taps into kind of what how I see Cameron and his legacy, and that he was kind of the perfect conservative response after the Blairite years, right? Because he was kind of similar to a young Blair in some ways with his like personality and charisma and stuff. And then he, as you talked about, he has that kind of social liberalism about him. And you're right, those comments today with a Johnson government, that individual wouldn't have got a slapper on the wrist for that, it would have just passed and it would have blown over with the news cycle and everything. And again, I wouldn't call Cameron the worst prime minister, but it's definitely a transitional figure into the Conservative Party that we have now, a more kind of upfront, brutal party.
I mean, Cameron actually called himself the heir to Blair.
Okay,
so he and I think that was probably a dig at Gordon Brown. We haven't mentioned Gordon Brown yet, but if we now do actually go to the financial crisis, basically Cameron, and this is one of the reasons why I think he could be considered as one of the worst prime ministers, because he as leader of the opposition made a point of blaming the global banking crisis on Gordon Brown and Gordon Brown's government, which is just not true. But also, the remedy to that, according to Cameron and Osborne, was austerity. As if you fix a global banking crisis by closing local libraries. It's absolutely absurd. But enough people fell for it to create that hung parliament, which then enabled that coalition between David Cameron and Nick Clegg to spring up. So, opportunistic is a criticism that's often used against politicians, and I kind of think it's a little bit unfair because that's kind of the role.
Yeah.
You're supposed to take your opportunities, but it was the wrong thing to do, and also I think even without the financial crisis, they still would have wanted to instigate austerity policies. So I think it was a lie as well.
Right. Yeah.
In terms of not really being honest with what their intentions were in the first place.
Yeah.
But what did you think to the coalition forming and obviously Gordon Brown was Prime Minister at the time of the 2010 election and didn't get enough seats.
Yeah.
Cameron ended up with more and was able to form a coalition with Nick Clegg. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I do remember that because that was when I was an anarchist at this point, so I was quite cynical with mainstream politics and like the possibility of it, kind of bringing about substantial like change in a good way. But I do remember that, and at that time, a lot of my friends supported the Lib Dems, and this is kind of something we talked about before. But Charles Kennedy was a very relatable leader for the Lib Dems before Clegg, and Clegg got the power in the end, but that was very much on the back, I think, of Charles Kennedy, and especially the injection of youth. The youth support in the Lib Dems during that period was, again, I would say, credit to Kennedy and his policies. And I remember when the coalition happened and a lot of people feeling betrayed.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
And I know there's a few of my friends who, were Lib Dems then, Lib Dem supporters, and that betrayal of like going into government with the Conservatives, and then what happened later with the betrayal of the student fees radicalized a lot of people in my generation, and a lot of people who turned to anarchism in my generation those were like some key events that really kind of jaded them on mainstream politics.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at this in terms of statistics, but anecdotally I know a lot of people who voted Lib Dem in that election, and nearly always they were voting Lib Dem because Labour didn't have a chance in their constituency. And they were voting Lib Dem in order to keep the Tories out. So Nick Clegg doing a deal with the Tories at the time, I remember feeling as though that was just it was just bizarre. It just didn't seem right. It didn't feel right. And maybe the Charles Kennedy years is what makes it feel so wrong. And looking back, I think what happened is you've got people like Charles Kennedy and Vince Cable who were prominent in the Liberal Democrats at the time. And certainly Vince Cable had been in the Labour Party and was one of those people that broke away with the SDP in the early 80s. You've got a lot of people in the party who were like that, but then you've also got a lot of people like Nick Clegg who went to private school and were more kind of classical liberals rather than modern liberals. And I think that's what's going on. The people who came to the fore were people like Danny Alexander and Nick Clegg, who were very much actually in tune with the Conservatives on economics. And that's what made it possible. Gordon Brown also didn't help. So Nick Clegg did ring Gordon Brown and ask to see whether they could have some kind of deal. But Gordon Brown apparently told him that he would definitely be the junior figure in the government and they'd have to do what Labour wanted. David Cameron wasn't quite so arrogant with him. But it might be that they were able to talk a similar kind of language because of the upbringing that they had and how rich they were and all of the rest of it. But also, we have to remember that the arithmetic of the House of Commons was much more in favour of the Tories and the Lib Dems doing a deal than Labour doing a deal with anybody. Even with the help of the Lib Dems, I don't think they would have had a majority, would they, from memory?
I don't think
they would have found it difficult to govern. So a coalition is what we got.
And that was definitely one of the excuses, that just jogged my memory of the Lib Dems saying there would be a more stable government. Because that was a big thing back then, stable government, wasn't it, during the coalition?
Absolutely. Well, the Conservatives had been warning of a hung parliament. They even did a party election broadcast pretending to be the hung parliament party where nothing would get done and everything would be decided behind closed doors and all of the rest of it. And in the end, they were more than happy to form one. Because ultimately what they say before an election is different from when they look at the statistics in front of them on the morning after the election and think, well, we've got to do a deal here in order to get power. Yeah, what you said there was interesting, I think, mentioning the student stuff. So, in very early on in the coalition years, we had the Occupy movement,
Yeah.
we had student riots, we had the riots in England in 2011, and then we've got the dismantling of the NHS as it was, all before this opening ceremony.
Yeah.
And I just think it's just a completely different country, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
It's already changed.
And Occupy as well, I think is really important to talk about in that, especially with austerity and reactions to the crash in 2008. And, Occupy in the United States was incredibly successful in keeping the narrative that the bankers tank the economy.
Yeah.
You talked about like Cameron saying to, blaming like Gordon Brown for the crash and everything. And like, yeah, that's opportunistic, but that happened everywhere. You had the Republicans kind of blaming the Democrats as well and everything for this. So, but what Occupy did in the United States, was give Obama the platform to not have to go down the route of austerity. And actually, stimulate the economy, and then other nations did this as well in different ways. Whereas we didn't have that in the UK. Occupy, it was an own goal to begin with by setting up camp outside of St. Paul's Cathedral, right? Because then the debate became, what's the legality of this being outside St. Paul's? That was the big conversation, not the message of Occupy. And I just think that that was, that's also a lesson for people, for political organizers, in that don't, you got to be spontaneous, but you also got to think about it. You can't just replicate things. You have to, why is it working? Because they were actually in a public park in New York, right? Yeah, they had that protection, but outside on the forecourt of St. Paul's, you don't have those same protections. And that's, and then with that, because we didn't have that public conversation on, hey, actually, the bankers tank the economy and everything. Cameron's argument, backed by, the media, allowed to proliferate.
It's strange, isn't it? Because we've got the Occupy movement also at the same time as, or around about the same time as the Arab Spring as well. Similar sorts of camps.
Yeah,
being done in a slightly different way and a different temperament to them. And that's all interesting. But you're right. Groups have to pick spaces carefully, don't they?
Absolutely.
And also, normally spaces are borrowed, aren't they? Because the state will move people eventually, and that's just the way it is. But I'm trying to remember what happened and why they ended up. I don't think it was planned that they ended up on St. Paul's. I seem to remember they had planned to be outside the London Stock Exchange, and then found out that it was private land. And then had to find somewhere else pretty quickly from memory. I went down there on the day it started because I knew it was happening. But I was a civil servant at the time, so I had to be careful what I got involved with. So I decided to just go and have a look and then leave. And as I went to leave, I realised that the police were kettling the whole area, so I couldn't go. So I stayed there for a little while. Eventually got out. But it was interesting to see it all setting up and how well organised it was and how well planned it was for also seemingly spontaneous. Of course, there's no such thing as that. There's so much work goes on behind the scenes to make something spontaneous. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
So there's a lot going on. The riots were really interesting as well, and the Home Office, the government, the police, the courts cracked down on that very, very severely. That's the last time we had widespread disorder in the UK, I would say.
Remember the riots of 2011, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was around about late summer, wasn't it? And so there's a lot going on, and then politically you've got things like the first and only so far independence referendum in Scotland in 2014. And then we head towards the 2015 election, where Cameron is able to govern without the help of the Liberal Democrats.
And then also, I think before that, it's the beginning of the austerity campaign in 2010s, and that there was a vibrant direct action movement in the UK with, UK Uncut being a big kind of organisation going into banks, and kicking up like a ruckus in branches and to raise awareness that, like, you know, so yeah, Occupy didn't do that over here. Didn't change the public narrative on like the bankers thing, the economy.
Yeah,
but UK Uncut tried doing that with some success. And then around that time, you know, we had this kind of idea of the Robin Hood tax going around, and David Graeber was talking about the Jubilee, and so we had that, and then there was a vibrant anti-austerity movement, which was predominantly direct action oriented, and that's kind of on the back of when Graeber was talking about this new anarchism coming in, which kind of evolved out of the elder globalization movement. So you had, you know, so his thing is, you know, he's small a anarchism, which is anarchists who put more emphasis on behaving anarchistically or you know, or living according to anarchist principles, rather than kind of digesting anarchism as an ideology, which he would call like capital A anarchism, and those people being organized into in kind of structured anarchist groups, normally in national anarchist groups, and subscribe a lot of the time to a program. And he presented the small A anarchists as being anti-programmatic, when, you know, it's actually, there's quite explicit program. If you read their work, the small A anarchism is all about programs, really, you know, like horizontalism, prefiguration, consensus. I mean, if that's not a program for like political change, I mean, I don't know what is. I always found that quite ironic.
And those ideas were really prominent.
And still are.
Yeah.
They kind of become common sense in activist circles now.
Well, I think also young people just instantly get all that stuff.
Yeah.
Or a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it is one of the... Maybe there's a link here to the culture wars and the anti-woke ideas of the right. You know, it just seems to be that they are reacting to the way people think these days.
Yeah.
Which is to try to be horizontal and to have consent at the focus of everything that they do.
Yeah. But then we had that, and also we had the student movement as well. So when the coalition came into being, you know, the Lib Dems, their whole thing was that they were going to scrap tuition fees.
Yeah.
And then once they got in, I mean, what was it, about 6 months, if that? They were like, no, that's not possible now. Not only are we not going to scrap them, we're going to raise tuition fees from 3,000 to 9,000, I think it was. So then that kicked off a whole student movement with student occupations at universities, the infamous storming of the Conservative HQ.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, like there was, and also the student movement really kind of mirrored the direct action movement of the UK Uncut stuff, and you know, and the student movement becoming autonomous from the student union as well, because the student union were calling for peaceful protests and everything. The student movement were kind of sticking their middle fingers up. And the student union president at the time, Aaron Peters, I think his name was, you know, just losing all power. And it was a great time of excitement as well for you know, I was in my early 20s then, a lot of people in my generation as well, and you know, we were kind of reading Graeber, we were reading Mark Fisher. There's this direct action movement going on, and the movement was kind of it was leaderless, if you will, but it wasn't anarchist. It was anarchistic, but a lot of people make this mistake that it was an anarchist movement, and it's not. It definitely had elements of anarchism, but it was just like, which I think really is like all social movements. It's just a mixture of different revolutionary and political traditions coming together.
But it also had a lot of people who did not see the Labour Party as the alternative.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And that is a really important part of this narrative as well, isn't it? Because that is going to change in 2015 when old Beardy becomes, Jeremy Corbyn, becomes leader of the Labour Party. That is going to take a whole load of people in a different direction, I feel. Yeah,
definitely. And you know, also, you know, people who supported Corbyn quite a lot, you know, like Navarra, like those people came out of UK Uncut and that student movement and everything, and you know, like that was their political education, if you will, and a lot of these people who were prominent individuals in that movement, would later on become Corbynistas, if you will.
Yeah. So a vibrant movement going on, and then suddenly seemingly not much going on. I think.
Right.
Cameron wins his second term, which we expect to last from 2015 to 2020.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. It just lasts a year because he decides that now is the right time to settle an argument that has been going on in his own party for decades, which is the Europe question. And that allows what we used to call the Eurosceptics, but we now call Brexiteers, to take over the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
And shift it, I would say, quite radically rightwards, and particularly in terms of social conservatism, I would argue.
Yeah.
So suddenly a massive shift in politics because of his... This is another reason why I think he might be the worst Prime Minister the UK has ever had. Because he offered people a chance to vote for change, which people desperately wanted, probably because of austerity, actually.
Yeah.
But he equated, or the people against him equated change with getting rid of the EU out of our lives, taking back control. Sounds like a lovely idea. I'm not sure that anybody feels as though they've got more control now than they had a few years ago. Less control is what we've got. And basically the keys of number 10 were passed on to, ultimately, well, first of all to Theresa May, who was a Remainer, but then suddenly became very, very committed to Brexit, and then ultimately to Boris Johnson, who was probably the least suitable person to run a country there's ever been.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, and he also was mayor of London before that, wasn't he? So he kind of climbed
he didn't do that very well either.
No. But, you know, there was, you know, during this time there was political organising going on, but I don't think it can be stressed enough how much, like, of a defeat it was when tuition fees were hiked. And that really was kind of a point where a lot of people were just completely disenfranchised with mainstream politics as well. And they're like, you know, as you said, the Labour Party then was just in disarray, and, you know, the Lib Dems sold out, if you will, or just showed their true colours. So, you know, they had free reign really to go in a direction that they wanted to go in. There was direct action going on and stuff. But yeah, it was...
Well, there's a lot of activity going on the left, but it was going on at Momentum meetings.
Right, yeah.
In support of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, when Corbyn came along, yeah. So, yeah. And before that, there was, you know, another building direct action movement as well coming on before, which all kind of got sucked up with Momentum, which I guess we can talk about.
I feel as though a lot of activity just kind of got sapped up by that Corbyn movement, by Momentum. And, you know, they came close to actually winning in 2017. Theresa May called an election because she didn't feel as though she had a big enough majority. She thought she'd wipe the floor with Corbyn, and she didn't. Yeah. There's something quite compelling, I think, about Corbyn about halfway through that election campaign. So if you drift your mind back, or if you remember, they had some local elections within the general election campaign.
Right.
And Labour did terribly in those local elections, and the media all said, if you do terribly in the local elections during a general election campaign, you're going to do just as bad in the general election. And about a week and a half maybe after those local elections, Corbyn and Labour published their manifesto for the election, and for the many, not the few. And Corbyn went around carrying it everywhere, and then the "Oh Jeremy Corbyn" songs started coming out. And I think there's something compelling about him just standing there saying, I've got this document I believe in.
Yeah, well, I think we have to talk about the Labour Party between Brown and Corbyn to kind of understand that, right? And then tie that in. You know, we had Miliband Miliband in between that, who was this kind of... He was kind of like a Blairite and like and Cameron kind of figure in the sense of him trying to be quite slick, you know, and professional and everything.
Yeah, I think he found that difficult.
Yeah, because he had no charisma and he wasn't slick, and you know he was incredibly dorky and stuff. But people saw right through that. Yeah, they knew that he wasn't legit and that he was kind of more of the same, like the new Labour years when people of my generation knew we needed something different from the Labour Party, and
Right. Okay. So I'm not sure I agree with this.
okay.
I'm not sure I agree with this. So are you saying that for people on the left he didn't look legit enough, or are you saying for the public at large?
For the left, I'm talking
I
about
see,
people of my
okay.
generation,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
who then would go and latch on to Corbyn.
I see.
Because, you know, people who hated Corbyn, like the kind of public, if you will, probably would have been more, you know, well, this was the argument when Corbyn came around. It was like he wasn't presentable, he wasn't electable and everything. Whereas there's people who had failed before seemingly were.
Yeah,
right?
okay. So substance over style. Kind
Right,
of thing,
right. And I think that, that kind of, our generation kind of saw through that. And when Corbyn came along, who, you know, wasn't slick, wasn't this PR man, you know, didn't have a professional spin doctor, who was just about policies, that was quite attractive to a lot of people. And I don't begrudge people for being attracted to that, you know.
I think Ed Miliband won because he was the left-wing figure in the leadership campaign that they had.
Yeah.
So against his brother, he was a better prospect for the left. And of course, the membership of the Labour Party tends to be to the left of their leadership. And so that's why he did well at that time. The press were labelling him Red Ed, weren't they? They were, you know, they were calling him a Marxist because basically his dad was a Marxist rather than him.
Yeah.
And he was obviously further to the left than David Miliband would have definitely been a continuity candidate. Ed Miliband for the public was easy to present as a potential left-wing menace, which is what the press will do with every Labour leader given half a chance.
Yeah, but I think people who were actually on the left saw right through that. And, you know, I think that was the difference. And he didn't galvanise the left like Corbyn did.
No, he didn't. And one of the reasons for that is that the Labour Party was terrible from Gordon Brown through Ed Miliband in actually trying to set the record straight. They accepted the need for austerity because they didn't challenge it.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And so going into the 2015 election, Labour had policies which were to cut the deficit.
Yeah.
Instead of presenting the alternative which we all knew and we all wanted.
Yeah.
So, okay, we're going on for quite a while now. Let's talk about Brexit then. So, you know...
But then, like, also, before we do that,
right.
with the rise of Corbyn, it's, you know, that's the context that then people latched on to Corbyn for. You know, so a lot of people did support Corbyn, but then a lot of people supported Corbyn because he seemed like the only option in the room. You know, so it's like we had this direct action movement, which was very vibrant and I would say quite strong, but failed ultimately. And then you had these years of austerity, seeming consensus of austerity across the political spectrum in Westminster. And then you did have organising going on in the background, but it was very much seen as a long-term thing. We're building towards something, right? It wasn't immediate. And then Corbyn comes along, and then there's this excitement that, hang on, like, he could get in power in a few years, and we could see real substantial change. And then that galvanized a lot of people, and even people who call themselves anarchists, you know, then will like kind of become Corbynistas and enjoy momentum and everything. And I think that's, you know, that has to really be stressed, which isn't really talked about a lot when people talk about Corbyn, but it was, you know, it was a bit of, it was opportunistic, but a bit of desperation as well. You know?
Maybe anarchism was just a phase these people were going through. These
well,
kids.
That's what people had like in. Yeah, there are people who are like kind of in positions of influence on the left now who would say that, which I think is absolutely...
I think they would say it, definitely.
Yeah, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And also it kind of speaks to what we were saying before, that wasn't actually anarchist, not to gatekeep anarchism, but, you know, just because something looks and smells like anarchism doesn't necessarily mean it is anarchism.
Yeah, sure.
And just because you act like an anarchist doesn't make you an anarchist.
Yeah.
You know, that's a very, like, defined...
It just sound like you are gatekeeping.
Well, I'm not gatekeeping. It's like, it's more what kind of like grates my gears is that, like, anarchism, you know, is for the 20th century, you know, Marxists has kind of portrayed it as, you know, it's poorer cousin, you know, intellectually. And then, you know, then the liberals and conservatives will also like jump onto that. So the thing with like utopian socialism, right, of the mid 20th century. Marx called them the utopian socialists. And then, for all of these liberal and conservative historians and academics that always like share on Marx and everything, they adopt his terms.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with anarchism. So when you talk about anarchism seriously as a political theory, there's still this kind of, on the left, this kind of inherent like prejudice, if you will, that like anarchism shouldn't be taken that seriously.
Yeah.
So it's like, so I'm not gatekeeping. I'm saying that anarchism actually means something, and what it means is important for us to understand and not to dilute it. So that's why I do it, not to gatekeep.
Sure. I mean, the Marxists will say whatever they feel they need to say to keep their religion going, won't they, basically?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Let me just dismiss it out of hand completely. Like that. So can we now move on to Brexit?
Yeah, that would be good.
Is that all right? So, what a mess. And May obviously is seen as an utter failure for making a decision on having that election in 2017 and then losing it, but still managing to cling to power just. And she had that confidence and supply agreement with the DUP, which was basically the DUP saying, we will vote for you if you have a vote of no confidence in Parliament. That's the confidence bit of the confidence and supply thing.
Right.
The supply bit is, we will vote for your Queen's speech and we will vote for your budget. If you lose a vote of no confidence, you're out. If you lose your Queen's speech vote, then basically the Commons are saying, we don't want your legislation. And if you lose your budget, there's no money to do anything.
Yeah.
So lose any of those votes, you're in deep trouble. Everything else was up for grabs, and the DUP did not hold back when they disagreed with what she was doing on Brexit and all the rest of it. And that is why those years from the 2017 to the 2019 election was so utterly entertaining. And this is a problem for us as anarchists as well. Politics has been spectacular for the last few years. And I find myself, because I'm interested in politics and because I teach British politics, I have to keep up to date with it, but I also enjoy keeping up to date with it. Yeah. And at the same time, I want to trash it all. So I don't want the state.
Yeah.
And yet here I am, obsessed with it, interested in it, watching it and keeping up to date with it all. It was thoroughly entertaining.
Yeah.
But they've also got us enthralled. I can't be the only person who during those times actually watched BBC Parliament live quite a few times, Yeah. It's just crazy.
Yeah, it is wild. It's I think what gets to me, what I find like fascinating is just the incompetence and the like it's just so it's just like how the Conservatives can cling to power, with all of the scandals and the just blatant and transparent incompetence, seeing all that play out, but then still hearing people say, hearing them say that they're like, for they're a government of stability and financial responsibility, when all the data says otherwise. And then also people in the public saying, but Labour would be worse, or Corbyn would be worse, and everything, and like still like just the support that they get. It's just like the cynicism of that's the only thing that I find fascinating. So you have this kind of spectacular kind of politics going on, if you will, that's like really gripping, but at the same time, it's really like sad and disheartening, that.
And there are structural reasons for this as well.
Right.
And that is, one of the structural reasons is the way that England dominates UK politics.
Yeah.
So out of the 650 constituencies we've got in the UK, I think it's 522 are in England. And England seems very, very likely to vote Conservative, no matter what. And so the rest of the UK, there's obviously a large section of people in England actually who don't want a Conservative government, but they have enough support to win a majority or close to a majority most elections. So combating that is really tricky. The opposition to conservatism in this country is split, and it's divided between, obviously the Labour Party is the major force, After the Scottish independence referendum, the SNP became much more prominent, and they've basically become a social democratic party over the years, or more of a social democratic party. They've replaced Labour, and it doesn't seem likely that the Conservatives will be out of power unless Labour can replace them again.
Right.
It's really, really hard for them. It's hard to imagine Keir Starmer in a coalition with the SNP,
Right.
because presumably what they would expect is another referendum.
Yeah.
That might be easier if they do get another referendum and they lose it. But if they don't get a referendum before the next election, it's going to be hard for Keir Starmer to be able to do a deal with them at all. And so the Conservatives dominate England, and that's all you need to do
Yeah.
to have power in the UK.
Yeah.
Then we've got the 2019 election when obviously Theresa May had to go in the middle of 2019. Boris Johnson became the obvious candidate. And immediately, the moment he was in Downing Street, tried to get a general election via various means. But the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which had been set up to keep the coalition going for a full 5 years, was still in place. And for an election to take place within the 5-year period, it required the agreement of the opposition parties because it needed a vote in Parliament. And why would you give Boris Johnson the go-ahead for an election during his honeymoon period when he's high up in the polls? He's a brand new Prime Minister and large sections of the population kind of like him. Right. Why would you do that? Enter into the fray Jo Swinson. Do you remember her?
I do, yeah.
Jo Swinson, leader of the Liberal Democrats, possibly, she trumps David Cameron in terms of incompetence.
Right.
As a leader of a main party in this country, she decided that she was going to support Boris Johnson to have an election in December 2019, forcing Corbyn to do the same, because he would have looked weak if he said he's not going to accept it.
Yeah.
And so they did. They gave Boris Johnson an election when he was in his honeymoon period.
Yeah.
It's absolutely absurd.
And that was really the end of Corbyn as well, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
He was under sustained attack. But
and I don't think Corbyn actually gets the right kind of criticism. Right? So he was obviously really, really unpopular during that election. And everybody says it's because of his stance on Brexit. I don't think the public really understood his stance on Brexit. I'm not sure he did either, actually, because he was going to have an election but not have a referendum, but not campaign for either side, which is a bit bizarre.
Yeah.
So people might have latched onto that, but he didn't announce it until partway through the campaign. I think he was already unpopular. I think he became associated with what people saw as a dysfunctional parliament. And I think he lost his popularity because he was always instructing his MPs to vote against the government, and it made Parliament look like it was indecisive. Actually, I think Parliament was doing its job.
And they're like the distinction between when you say people thought that about Corbyn, there you're talking about the general public, if you will, like not the left, right? Because I guess people that we'll be talking to are on the left.
Yeah,
like we're not talking about that people.
Who knows? Who knows who's going to listen?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone listens, but I think that's important to clarify. And then it was shortly after that Corbyn was ousted, right?
Yeah, Corbyn insisted on hanging around and for quite a while. Yeah. So Keir Starmer didn't take over until April 2020, by which stage the pandemic had started.
Right.
So politics gets even more spectacular this time because of a global pandemic. And Boris Johnson got himself a very big majority, 80-seat majority in December 2019, and then found himself not able to actually do the things he said he was going to do because of the pandemic, at least immediately. They've managed to get through some of their manifesto before he was ousted himself earlier this year. But Corbyn hung on until April, trying to shift the Labour Party so that it wouldn't just simply go rightwards. Of course, Keir Starmer came along. There was a report into anti-Semitism, which Keir Starmer said should not be criticised in any way. Corbyn criticised it, because presumably he criticised it because it was about his time as leader.
Yeah.
And so Keir Starmer put himself in such a position that to save face, he had to withdraw the whip from Jeremy Corbyn. So Jeremy Corbyn is no longer a Labour MP.
Yeah.
And the rumour is he's going to try and stand for London Mayor.
Oh, is that so? I didn't know that. Actually.
That's the rumour.
Okay.
We will wait and see what happens with that. It's what Ken Livingstone did, and Tony Blair forced him to do it as an independent, wouldn't have him as the official Labour candidate.
Right.
And then when he won and he was successful and seen as a good mayor, Tony Blair had to apologise for it.
Right.
Keir Starmer seems to think that to follow Blair, you've got to attack the left.
Right.
Which I'm not sure is really the main message that I would take from the Blair years.
Yeah, and also it's a completely different context, like what we were talking about with, that generation of people, who now, like my generation in mid-30s now, and so people slightly older than us and slightly younger than us have that similar sentiment who, it's a different context. You can't attack the left in the same way, and I think and also you got people now like in my generation who kind of are in like positions of influence who can bite back a little bit as well. I think you're going to be held accountable a little bit more, I think.
So now we're in a situation where pandemic we haven't really talked about, but it links back to that opening ceremony of the Olympics and the focus on the NHS. There was a large segment of that opening ceremony on the NHS, but it was an NHS that had already gone.
Right.
We'd already lost it. And like I said, the reforms under Andrew Lansley were such that they dismantled the hierarchy of the NHS. Sounds great. Let's dismantle the hierarchy. But they didn't allow for parts of the NHS to discuss things with each other and for any kind of clear line of command and coordination, which when the pandemic struck, that is why there was such a problem regarding getting protective equipment to places and having any at all, and having any plans. Who's going to coordinate them if you've dismantled everything?
Right. There's
no coordination at all, and there was no protection for care homes, as we know, and so like the problems of the pandemic were sowed by David Cameron and his government,
right,
made worse by the incompetence of Boris Johnson and his government for sure. But there's a clear link there. David Cameron's decisions were astonishing. His decision on austerity was just ideological and had nothing to do with the banking crisis, and didn't even seek to fix the banking crisis, but was presented that it was going to. His decision on health was absolutely terrible, and he probably just saw it as Thatcherite. But it's come back to haunt us while he's safely off in his retirement.
Yeah.
And his decision to hold a referendum that you're offering people a chance to vote for change at a time when they wanted change, utterly stupid. So David Cameron.
So that's your case against.
That's my case. Those three things. I think. I think history will judge him really, really harshly.
Right.
And he laid the groundwork for Boris Johnson, who's a terrible prime minister as well, very incompetent. But then again, as an anarchist, I think, well, do we want competent prime ministers? Should we care whether we have competent or incompetent prime ministers?
Right.
What's better?
Yeah.
What's worse? I'm not sure. But we can, I think, as anarchists, we should also judge these people on what they do, regardless of whether we want the state or not. And now we are in a situation where we're going to have either Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak in a few days' time when this goes out.
Yeah.
We've got a few weeks to go as we record this.
So when we were recording the video of Sunak gloating that he's redirected funds from inner city neighbourhoods to rural communities had just leaked, and Liz Truss is firmly in the lead at the moment. But who knows what's going to happen in the next 2-3 weeks.
I think what I would like to do is say that whatever happens, politics is going to carry on in Britain being spectacular.
Right.
Because whoever wins has actually got to try to do what they pledged they're going to do.
Right.
Meanwhile, none of the pledges actually take account of the major issues. So the planet's burning. We've had the hottest temperatures on record in the UK. We are in a cost of living crisis, the like of which, I don't know, are we looking at 2008 again, or are we looking at the 1930s?
I think we're looking, more like the 1930s.
Or maybe we're looking at something completely fresh, because maybe history doesn't tell us how this is going to pan out. And it's utterly terrifying, really, as we sit here thinking, what are the energy companies going to do? We've got a system of paying for energy that makes no sense at all. That there's this government quango that decides how high the price cap can go, and yet they are allowing the price cap to go high when people can't afford it. Who controls us? Who rules us? Who are our rulers? Our landlords and the energy companies appear to be the people that decide our fate now.
Yeah.
There's going to be some spectacular politics going on, because neither of the Tory candidates have got a clue what they're going to do about this at all. Meanwhile, the tensions in their party are huge. There's a firm block of MPs in the Conservative Party who like Boris Johnson and expect Boris Johnson to come back, and expect whoever takes over from him to do things that Boris would agree with.
Right.
And so if it's Rishi Sunak who wins, he's going to be in trouble right from the start, because they don't like him. They see him as someone who stabbed Johnson in the back.
Right.
If Liz Truss takes over, how much will she distance herself from him? Does she want to be her own person? Is going to be the key question. There's going to be a budget coming up where they will have to deal with the cost of living crisis in some way. And at the moment, they seem to only want to do it by offering help to people who already have good, well-paid jobs. So the ideas that they're going to cut income tax don't help the people who are struggling right now.
Right.
The idea that they might raise the threshold at which you start to pay income tax, does not affect anybody other than the richest people in society.
Right.
And so there's going to be tension over that. But on top of all of this, the Conservative leadership campaign has not made any attempt, there has not been an attempt by the Conservative Party to account for the Boris Johnson years and his downfall.
Right.
His ultimate downfall came because he supported Chris Pincher, who turned out was groping men at a party and had a history of this. But there's also the Owen Paterson scandal. Owen Paterson was an MP who was lobbying, taking money, quite a lot of money as well, from 3 firms and trying to get them good deals with the government. We've then got the whole Partygate stuff. The Conservative Party hasn't taken account of the Dominic Cummings years at all. So we've got a party that is at war with itself and is in no fit state to actually deal with why it's got to the position it's got. And then, of course, we've got a population in England, at least, who will still vote for them.
Right, yeah.
So politics is going to be spectacular. I would imagine a general election within the next year.
Right, okay.
Which the Conservatives could well win.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, so then on the backdrop of that, we have, a left, and then the anarchist movement, if you can even call it that, of the last, 15 years, in that, had huge influence in the anti-austerity movement and in the student movement. and then kind of, I think, anarchistic thinking, and I don't think we can really overplay the influence David Graeber's work on direct actions had on contemporary activism and revolutionary politics. So these kind of anarchistic modes of organizing, horizontalism, prefiguration, direct action has become like the de facto mode of organizing. So you kind of have this anarchistic tendency in contemporary radicalism and activism. We haven't talked about the climate people, Extinction Rebellion, but they have these anarchistic tendencies in them. But we don't have a visible anarchist movement, we had Momentum come on, which was really supporting Corbyn, and that kind of sucked out a lot of energy in this direct action movement, and then kind of directed it into getting Corbyn elected. And then you had a lot of people, who then turned their backs on anarchism, if you will, and kind of became more social democratic. Or you had, these anarchists who were temporarily supporting Corbyn, kind of what Ruth calls anarcho-Corbynism. And then Corbyn goes, and then that's just kind of, then the floor just falls out beneath a lot of these Corbynistas and Momentum and everything. And so now you have these people on the left who, kind of Novara Media kind of like represents this a little bit, and that, they kind of fashion themselves as left libertarians and that, but really they're kind of social democrats when you like break down their politics and what they're advocating for and everything, at least what they do majority of the time. You have that, but then you don't really have like an anarchist presence, and it's, we're going through this time of great change and uncertainty. So then what would an anarchist politics look like? And what would an anarchist movement look like in this period, like building an anarchist movement? So this episode, we're talking to Ruth Kinna, theorist and historian based in Loughborough in the UK, roughly around the concept of anarchist politics, how Ruth understands it, and Ruth's advice to anarchists looking to develop an anarchist politics in their community. Okay, so we have Ruth Kinna today, and me and John and Ruth have known each other for a few years now.
Yeah,
so we have.
Yeah, me and John were PhD students of Ruth's.
Indeed.
Two very different topics, but based on anarchism. And so today we're going to more have a chat with Ruth around the idea of anarchist politics.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, how do we define that even?
Yeah. So that was the
difference. So I think it's good to talk about anarchist politics, because often it's anarchism is otherwise kind of labelled as an anti-politics, which doesn't make any sense to me. So anarchism, I think, comes at politics just with a different kind of squint. But the idea that you can't have... I mean, if we think about politics as being about power or resolving disagreements, working out, how we want to make decisions about our everyday lives, anarchism's a politics. Because it's a politics. It's just that it works in different conditions, right?
Yeah, and that allows us to make a distinction with official politics, if we could use that phrase, perhaps. It seems to me that an anarchist politics would perhaps talk maybe a completely different language to official politics.
So it starts as I think it makes sense to think of it as a rejection of institutional politics and the idea that we have to have fixed decision makers. We have to have leaders who know best, or even if they don't know best, who somehow are going to be charged with making decisions that will be good for us. So anarchism starts from the opposite point of view and says the only people who should be making decisions about the way you live are you, and that you do that by collaborating with other people, cooperating with other people, not necessarily agreeing with them, not necessarily sharing their perspectives. But when you don't, what's the alternative to talking it out? Then that's what politics is.
But official politics, in a liberal democratic state seems to be all about winning, doesn't it? And the winners make the decisions.
That's right. So, yeah, I suppose, contemporary liberal democracy, so the systems that we've known since, only since 1945, actually, they're not that old, are based on the idea that if you have fair competition and everybody can participate in that, irrespective of the economic resource they might have to enter into that participation, which is another kind of matter, but the competition itself will generate good leadership, and good leadership is the safeguard, the liberal safeguard against mob rule. So the starting point is the risk of mob rule, which is, inverted commas, anarchy, and elite power is its answer, is its response.
Is it then ironic that elections are effectively the mob agreeing to one platform or another?
Yeah, so I suppose that, the populist turn is that kind of, it's brought out the liberal anxiety about the extent to which the systems themselves have become corrupted. So actually, the so-called sensible, benign, benevolent elites have themselves decided that what they're going to do is mobilise a mob, part of the mass, part of the constituents, in order to pitch groups of people against each other. So democracy then becomes exactly what people like de Tocqueville feared it would become. It becomes a kind of a free-for-all and a very aggressive kind of space.
And everything's geared up to perpetuate that, isn't it? I spend a lot of time watching TV news, and you've got 24-hour news channels. They've got enough time to get a full range, or as full a range of views as possible. And yet they have these 3-minute sections where they pit two opposing views against each other, and where you get to the end of that 3 minutes, you're back where you started, essentially. No one's really progressed anywhere. There's no common ground at all. And it seems to me that anarchism is really geared up towards finding common ground so that we can actually agree what the solutions are.
Yeah, so within the institutional frame, because you have this competition, and because of the way that I suppose institutional politics has developed through a party system, and particularly in an adversarial system, so where British democracy has become the kind of the one of the models for electoral politics, for institutional electoral politics, we end up with this idea that a balanced conversation is one that involves both parties. And that everybody must fit into one of those camps, which is, of course, everybody knows is a nonsense. And anarchism starts from a completely opposite point of view. It starts from the point of view that you have to empower people to bring them into a kind of a political space, so that they can start redetermining what they think the priorities for their lives are, and then thinking about how they're going to collectively deliver those priorities or realise those priorities. So it is a completely different way of thinking about politics, I think.
How do you feel we're getting on at doing this then?
Well, we're still hanging in there, I guess. From my perspective, I suppose, mainstream opinion can see the the problems of liberal political systems are evident. Trump has made them very obvious. It's become very obvious in this country too, in the UK. The problem, I think, that defenders of liberal democracy have is that they don't have any mechanisms actually to keep this kind of populist, aggressive mobilisation of the demos in control. So where do you look? Well, it seems that, I suppose, the traditional left has kind of collapsed. But what we do have, and it's interesting, I think, that at this kind of moment of liberal democratic crisis, that the models that we have tend, in terms of contemporary politics, they are anarchistic. So, and what is the government doing about it? Well, they're trying to stop it. They're trying to sort of clamp down on protest, because that's where they see people mobilising and actually making decisions for themselves. So if you look at things like Extinction Rebellion, it's an anarchistic movement. If you look at the kinds of activities that went on during the pandemic, mutual aid, all of these things. I mean, that's being co-opted, and any kind of alternative voice is being institutionally repressed.
Yeah.
So I think there is an anarchist politics out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the time people naturally go towards it as well. They can see the benefit because they are in control. And during Brexit we heard taking back control as a phrase, and I just don't feel as though many people feel as though there's a lot of control in their lives. So actually making a stand for something makes sense. I mean, it's pretty neoliberal trait, I think, to attack anything that's collective, isn't it?
Yeah.
Any kind of collective action is going to be frowned upon. So if you've got a group of people gluing their hands to the motorway, like Extinction Rebellion have, and Insulate Britain, it's going to kind of get their backs up, isn't it?
Yeah,
and,
that's right. And we've got a winter coming up where people are going to have to organise. Or will be incentivised to organise locally and collectively in order to get through, the crisis that's about to hit them.
Yeah.
And already people are talking about setting up warm spaces. I mean, this kind of activity is going to happen actually through local decision making and people actually cooperating with each other. So I don't think that's the same as saying that it's anarchy. But certainly it's an anarchistic way of thinking about a problem.
I was just about to ask you said anarchistic. So what does that mean?
Well, I wanted to kind of jump on that, the kind of anarchistic. And then what you said before, that anarchist politics isn't about, domination and winning, but kind of talking through problems and seeing through problems. I was just wondering if this speaks to kind of what you were talking about in your book, The Government of No One. Is it the anarchization, that concept, and whether that's kind of, making things anarchistic is a way of developing anarchist politics again.
So I mean, I use the term because I quite like the way that it's hopefully it makes a process intelligible, because we're familiar with the idea of liberalising something, and we're familiar with the idea of, or perhaps less familiar, but in principle we're kind of familiar with the idea of republicanising something. We're familiar with the idea of feminising something. So these are processes which are directed towards certain kinds of principle, if you like. So liberalism, I suppose, would be directed towards equalising rights, or making rights equally operable for people. Feminising is to do with overcoming patriarchal constraints, or the constraints that prevent women from realising their potential. And republicanising is to, ensure that the government's decisions or the constitution is organised so that there can be no singular dominating voice, and the interests of the public are tracked by those who make the decisions. So from that point of view, anarchising something points up the possibility that we can move our politics towards a more collaborative, more cooperative and collectivist engagement with each other. But in order to do that, you have to attend to the balances of power that actually make that cooperation currently difficult or impossible. So anarchising something inevitably means that you're involving everybody who wants to engage in a project in determining the way that project is going to be run.
Right.
And the reason that I use the term is because I wanted to get away from the idea that in order to promote anarchism, you have to change people's heads and make them anarchists. And I don't think that that's true. I think it's great that people are anarchists. I think it's great that people identify with anarchism. But I don't think that you're going to advance anarchist politics by telling people they've got to think in a particular way.
Right. So this kind of it echoes in some way to prefiguration. But prefiguration, I'd say, a lot of them, are interested in getting people to behave anarchistically. That's different to getting people thinking anarchistically, right?
Yeah, I suppose the difference. Maybe I don't want to push the difference too far, but prefiguration kind of assumes that you're already signed up to an anarchist politics,
Right.
because you're prefiguring.
Yeah.
So even if you're saying, well, this is an endless process, or this doesn't have a definite content, it must have some kind of idea of what's desirable. I don't see that you can have a prefigurative politics unless you have some kind of, small utopia to structure it. So what I'm saying is that I'm attracted to that. I think it's great, but I think if you're working on the basis of a kind of pushing an anarchistic community politics, the first thing you're going to do is not stand there and say, oh, we need to sort of think about what anarchy is and not having leaders. What you're going to do is surely say to people, how are we going to make this work between us? What is going to enable you to make decisions with me to do X?
Right. Yeah.
But does that then, if you do organise some kind of group along that basis, does it then start to have a political discussion? Is a political discussion inevitable and necessary at some point to kind of talk about the power relationships in society?
So it depends I suppose that's a different kind of concept of political, because it seems to me that any group of people who come together in order to realise on a project of any sort, they are engaging in some kind of political act.
Yeah.
And particularly if you're thinking about a context in which people are being incentivised to come together from on the basis of meeting people's needs or helping them. This is definitely a politics, right? And it's and it speaks to concerns that not just anarchists have, but anarchists have always had.
Yeah.
So if you then say, well, how do you anarchise it in order to make conscious the rules that you're promoting through your cooperation as being horizontal or leaderless, then I think that comes out of it. If you think about Extinction Rebellion, actually they write those rules into the start.
Yeah.
So these are not rules that are. They call it democratic, but it is anarchistic. So this is not a politics that's unfamiliar. I just don't think you need to sort of say, oh, if you're an anarchist, then you have to subscribe to this.
Sure.
I think the anarchy and the anarchisation comes out of the collaboration.
Yeah, and what you were saying reminded me of an article that I read in Freedom at some point last year about the mutual aid groups that had set up during COVID and the difficulties that they found, difficulties such as being co-opted by the Labour Party and trade unionists and so on, and also even some examples of Conservatives getting on the back of it and using the phrase mutual aid as if it's something that belongs to them, and also those groups not necessarily then kind of capturing that kind of spirit that they started in. And it all fizzles off because the state suddenly is providing things. And that's what we see with a lot of disasters, I think, isn't it? Or a lot of crises. You find that the people immediately spring up offering mutual aid, and then the state comes in and everything fizzles out. How do we deal with it? Yeah, have you got a sense of how we might handle that sort of thing? Because it seems to be, it's probably an age-old problem, isn't it? I
think it is an age-old problem, and I think so. If you're going to remain optimistic, I think you have to think along the lines that any experiment, however fleeting, has made a difference to your existing reality and exists in people's memories, or can exist in people's memories. And that makes the difference. The way that, in the end, it seems to me that the only way that you make those sort of microcosmal activities and those hidden memories really count is through organising. That's the lesson, right? And you can do that either through unions, or you can do it through cooperatives, or you can do it through all kinds of different kinds of vehicle that support non-dominating practice. But in the end, unless you write this kind of behaviour into more into groups that are going to have a likely to have a longer history and are reasonably easy for anybody to join, then anarchism will always remain in its niche. And that's the lesson of Spain. It's the lesson of of Madrid recently. The 15M. These were organised movements. These were not just collections of people gathering in squares. And that's where, and it's the connections that you can make. So I would say also things like Catalonia, the referendum in Catalonia. I mean, the anarchists were, they're not nationalists, but they were certainly taking part in that process and supporting that process. And that way you start building relationships and building trust. And I think you can see the same things in Scotland. You can see them in these sort of grassroots movements where, if you like, to go back to the Taking Back Control, where people are thinking differently about what control means, and not in terms of going back to some crazy, imperial past, but actually thinking about what it means to exercise independence as a community.
When we were talking about British politics, Shane, you talked about lots of movements before Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, and the way you talked about them was as if they were anarchistic. Is that kind of what? Does this correspond to what you said?
Kind of, yeah. That kind of leads on to a question I wanted to ask actually, because I think Graeber was onto something when he says the kind of anarchistic sensibility and activist organising has really kind of taken root and kind of become common sense, and that's kind of what I was saying with the anarchistic tendencies as well. So just, I think sometimes there's a temptation for some people to say, when the state disappears, people fall back and kind of automatically act anarchistically, which I don't think is true. So I just kind of, the importance, I think, of promoting these, like this mindset and these behaviors to keep that spirit there just below the surface. So when there is a space, people are familiar with this kind of this modes of social organization, right? So just kind of the importance, I think, of organizing in those ways and exposing people to those. And so, but also what I wanted to ask is, I was thinking this one time I was at a talk with George Shakely, I think his name is. He was a member of the society, a movement for a new society. Andrew Cornell talks about this in Oppose and Propose. And he was talking about his new book on Scandinavian economics and everything, and how he was, trying to get his American family and that to kind of like think more social democratically and everything. So then, so I asked him, well, when you're talking about these ideas to people who are like collectivist ideas in a country and with people who are like very individualistic, how do you propose these without people automatically have a knee-jerk reaction, like rejecting them? And he's like, well, I just present it as a problem. Like we have this problem here. How do we solve the solution? Which I think is useful, but at the same time, people's imagination of how to solve that problem could be limited if they're not exposed to, I guess, an anarchist politics beforehand, or like the possibility that actually we can solve this problem ourselves without an authority, without appealing to authority to to solve it for us. So that kind of leads on to a question of, I feel like I kind of answered it a little bit, but the role of anarchists in creating an anarchist politics, like where do you see them going into spaces and kind of talking about getting people to think more anarchistically?
In terms of spaces, I don't think anything's barred.
Right.
That's kind of that's part of the lesson of Colin Ward, isn't it? That
right.
You mentioned, John, the way that sort of mutual aid appeals to conservatism. Colin Ward had a long conversation with David Green about voluntary organisation, and was not afraid, I suppose, to blur the lines between the institutional left and right in order to support what he thought was the best anarchised solution to a policy or the way of thinking about a policy. So I think that's part of it, that you talk to everybody, but I don't think that it's just about going into anarchist spaces. I mean, you said something about, the appeal to authority. So there's a certain amount that I mean, I think that's less of a problem where you have actually people trying to work together to find solutions, because I don't see people naturally deferring to someone just because they say they're the boss.
Right.
They'll do it at work, they'll do it at all kinds of places, but not if they're trying to organise a project together. They might elect a committee. They might decide that some particular person is good at doing something, but they're not actually normally going to say, oh, well, we'll make you the leader who's going to make everything work for us. I just don't see that happens a lot. But that practice doesn't rid us of the habit of thinking that authority is our natural kind of is our norm. So the other sort of attack, if you like, is on that thinking, and so practices are one thing, but and those habits of non-dominating horizontal organisation, that repertoire of action is so important, but it needs a push too to make it conscious. And that's where I think you have to promote the ideas. You have to show that this is not nonsense. You have to, and in that sense, nothing significant has changed since 1840, when Proudhon says, such is so ingrained is your habit of authority that you think anarchy is chaotic, often violent, and all the rest of it. And that's still a pervasive idea. So everything that can be done to disabuse people of that is important, in my view.
I guess there's a possibility, though, that in trying to promote something, you become a de facto leader, or you end up in a leadership role. How do you do it without?
Well, I think I've managed to avoid that.
How do you do it though without? So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that what we're talking about is spaces that are direct democracies in some way, and how do you control the narrative in a direct democracy if people aren't already anarchistic or anarchists? Is that seems to be one of the problems that anarchism has, in that it wants to get more people involved with certain things, but once they're involved, it doesn't necessarily have the mechanism to push that down a particular direction.
But I'm not sure that anarchists are trying to. I mean, are anarchists trying to push things in a particular direction? I'm not sure about that.
They might have wanted to in something like the mutual aid groups.
Okay, I accept that. But I don't think. I mean, for all of that recuperation, and actually, let's face it, there were people who were, served with all kinds of health and safety notices and threats and all kinds of stuff that was going on. That frustrates people, but it doesn't stop the lesson is there, if you like. I mean, I do think that for however long it's lasted, those people who were involved, they're the people who then go and replicate this somewhere else. But unless you're clear about what it is you're replicating and why, then I think you're missing a beat.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's something else apart from the organisational and apart from the practice, and that there is something about being consciously committed to a principle of self-government, non-domination. That means something, and that those ideas can develop through a practice. But I think they have to be developed, and they can also be developed independently of a practice to help people think about the kinds of things that they're doing and how they might do it differently in order to meet the obstacles that they're likely to be confronted with.
Do you get the sense that anarchist activity or anarchism in this country has declined in recent years? Or, I mean, we talked about it, didn't we, regarding movements perhaps and individuals heading towards the Labour Party when Corbyn came along, and momentum organising very effectively around him. Do you get the feeling that anarchism lost a lot of people when Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party?
I just don't know. I mean, I suppose. I mean, I'm aware that Corbyn excited people who thought of themselves as anarchists, which I found puzzling, simply because I just didn't think that there was a prospect of Corbyn being able to deliver on anything that was like anything anarchistic. And I don't think that was his programme. I mean, for me, it was extraordinary also that Corbyn was demonised as this crazy socialist by the right, when actually what he was advocating was not much different from the platform in 1945. He was trying to save services.
Yeah.
And that's it's pretty depressing. I think that we've come to that. That's what institutional politics has come to, that we can't even preserve anymore the things that we thought were the basis of the consensus. I just don't know whether people who became disaffected with his with the way in which he was treated have kind of withdrawn from politics. I suspect that it's all disappointments are hard, but I just don't know. I can't gauge it, but I would have thought that, as I say, coming into the sort of the desperate situation that we're heading towards, that those people are not going to be motivated to do stuff in their groups. Yeah. And that would be my hope.
Yeah, absolutely. So there will be a lot of people who are disaffected with official politics the way it's gone.
Yeah.
Even if they're organising in momentum and all what they want ultimately is a Labour government, if they're doing other things as well, then they might be doing some good things.
But hopefully also, people will be joining unions. There's a real resurgence there.
Yeah.
And that's an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think also, it might sound like I'm being on the drum of prefiguration a bit, but I'm not trying to knock that theory at all, but how we understand anarchism and an anarchist movement in kind of the turn of the century of this prefiguration direct action movement, it was very kind of like sociological kind of analysis and understanding of anarchism in my view, in that just because you behave anarchist you're deemed as an anarchist. And I'm kind of interested of what are these people thinking, who are they influenced by, what are their visions for future society. Behaving in one way I don't think is enough. There has to be a kind of a consciousness there as well to make it anarchist. And I'm not entirely sure that consciousness was there as much as some people would like to make out of that kind of. So there, I would you agree that that might help explain why some people would turn to Corbynism, because they didn't really kind of they thought behaving anarchist was anarchism, when it's not. It's more than that. And I don't know if you agree with that, but if you do you think this kind of speaks to the importance of an anarchist politics and getting people thinking anarchistically rather than just trying to get them to behave anarchistically temporarily?
Yeah, so, no, I do agree with that, and I suppose I'm just trying. Sorry, so I think there are two things for me that stick out about that kind of what came out of the movements that culminated, I guess, in Occupy. One is that they were framed as protest movements, and that was a limitation. So whatever the practice is, for as long as you think that you're protesting about something within a liberal democratic regime, you're not challenging it directly. Because they were complex movements, and there were different things going on in those movements, but they were framed as protest movements, and that framing was not systematically undone. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing, I suppose, which is my kind of bugbear, is I do agree with you that the practice became the priority and the test, if you like, of something being anarchist as opposed to Marxist. In a sense, who cares if the practice? So why invoke the Marxism? Why say, oh well, now is our century, now is our time after the collapse? I mean, the coincidence of the collapse of the Soviet Union was really unfortunate. But if you're going to say this is our time and this is our movements, then I'm really perplexed why it was that people not only didn't go back to their history, but actually thought going back to their history was going to damage that movement somehow. That was a whammy for me. Because people in the previous century who were getting all excited about the possibility of mobilising a movement were looking precisely at union movements, at syndicalist movements, at all kinds of movements to try and get those ideas embedded. And they did talk to everybody who would listen to them in order to promote that politics. And they were very explicit. I mean, if you look at the what was written in Freedom in 1890, I mean, this was extremely well articulated and explained and normalised. And pretty much every institution that you can think of was subject to an anarchist scrutiny. And I think, we don't, we have some of that, and I'm really, I think it's, we should celebrate the things that we do have. We have some brilliant publishers, we have some brilliant newspapers, and they're the tools that we should be using to get those ideas out there. Because I think otherwise you're right. And I think actually going back to your history is part of that.
Yeah, I think Dope Magazine's really good at doing that, right?
Exactly.
And that's why I like reading about that. It's looking forward. It's not always looking back.
Yeah, and it's covering things from all kinds of perspectives, so that you can start pulling out the affinities. You can start thinking about the challenges that different people face, and just having a conversation.
I guess that kind of speaks to something else as well, because you're aware that I'm reading the Alarm, the journal that was edited by Albert Parsons, one of the Haymarket markers, and they're drawing widely. Like William Morris features probably more than Marx. But yet the history will say that they were heavily influenced by Marx. Probably influenced more by Henry George. It's probably in Progress, the Capital. They were drawing from lots of things. Wollstonecraft, Paine. But when a political tradition matures, there's kind of this danger of it kind of solidifying in thought. And how do we keep that kind of plurality and experimentation in thought and anarchism? Or do you think anarchist politics is the remedy to that? Constantly experimenting with ideas, and kind of how would an anarchist?
I don't know. I don't think anarchism has a silver bullet. I think in the end, anarchism is trying to persuade people that they should be doing things for themselves, and that's tough. I mean, it's tough for people to do that. It involves time and energy. And it's tough in terms of thinking about what you do when you don't have permanent arbitration. When suddenly it's only you that's going to sort out something that might be really tricky, really confrontational, really difficult. And it's only us. That's all there is.
Yeah.
So that's really hard. But I mean, if that's one of the principal lessons of anarchist politics, then anarchists don't have to claim everybody else's ground and say we need to make you anarchist. I mean, you can find affinities. So I mean, it seems to me that anarchists can talk to the Small Axe programs. Steve McQueen. Anarchism can talk to Me Too. Anarchism can talk to Black Lives Matter. These are the movements that people are actually involved in. And if anarchists don't talk to them, and they just they're just maintaining their niche somewhere, then I don't really see what the point is. They're the ready-made movements, and particularly some of this sort of recent feminism, being, we need to be safe on the streets at night. So if the default solution is let's have more police, where's the anarchist voice saying that's not going to protect you?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I feel like a lot of that kind of voice is coming from Black abolitionism, especially in the States, which obviously has affinity with anarchism. But another thing, so my experience, it's sometimes when you talk about this way of kind of injecting anarchist ideas and kind of pushing an anarchist way, people might dismiss it as being reformist, which I would disagree with. And I was just kind of thinking like how you kind of conceptualize it, because when I read earlier stuff, there was a lot of anarchists who believed in kind of like evolution, and evolving into a new way, and kind of, do you see anarchist politics as more of a kind of, I know that people don't like the term evolution in the humanities, but do you see it more like that, and like, differentiation between reformism and kind of like evolving more to an anarchistic kind of position?
So, I mean, for me, the significance of the language of evolution is to try and point up that you can't just think of a moment of change, which is going to transport you from one world to another. And when anarchists talked about evolution, actually, I think they were talking really about education.
Right.
So, I mean, clearly there were some people who thought that there was this kind of, process of progressive change. But I mean, the number of people who actually thought that, I mean, I think there were fairly few. I mean, Kropotkin is sometimes interpreted in that way, but I just don't think that holds water. And particularly, when you think about, where his activism was taking him, which was, attending commune anniversary celebrations, doing coast to coast, talks, lectures, publishing cheap editions of books so he could get to the widest possible audience, engaging in any kind of, 8-hour day against the Spanish Inquisition, all of these things. He's involved in all of these popular movements. Now, if you say, that's a kind of a reformism, then, well, what's the revolutionary position? Because reformism is the opposite or it's the mirror image, isn't it, of something else? And I'm not quite sure what the something else is. When I see, I mean, the first programme I saw in the Small Axe series was about, the police in Notting Hill, and the resistance that came out of that. That's an inspiring example, it seems to me, of a community getting together and deciding how it's not only going to defend itself against police aggression, but then take its case into a courtroom and win. That's a hugely important lesson, and for me, that I wouldn't want to call those people anarchists, but it speaks to anarchism for me.
Yeah, that's the only episode I saw of it. Inspirational stuff,
Yeah.
really, and there's no wonder that some of those people remain prominent
Yeah.
for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's right, and actually did
huge.
make links to anarchists.
Yeah.
So how would you advise kind of anarchists trying to connect with other radical movements and traditions? Again, I'm thinking of Black abolitionism here in the United States, who are kind of doing a lot of work on, defunding the police and community protection and everything. And I kind of see this even in, I don't know much about it, but when I was reading kind of about the Black Panthers and everything, it didn't seem like there was much kind of, some of the Black Panthers became anarchists, but anarchists not going there and supporting, like how do you think that, you can kind of talk to these other movements?
So I think, you have to, you work from where you are, okay? So, I mean, you can join a union. It's not going to be the union that you designed, but actually joining the union can make a difference. So that would be one thing. You can go to, I mean, there are, meetings held all over the place for different groups of people to, doing different kinds of actions. I mean, I think, you have to be careful about seeking or participating in movements, I mean, particularly intersectional movements where, you know, you might not be immediately embraced, particularly if you're going along there and saying, hey, you know, I'm going to tell you about anarchism. That's not going to go down well, is it? But, you know, I just think anarchist politics can only work on the basis of what you can do and how you can integrate politics into your ordinary life. You're just, the only difference is that you're doing it as someone who's committed to a certain way of practicing politics. But you're not doing anything different from anybody else. I mean, you're not going to join a major political, well, maybe you are going to join a major political party. I mean, I doubt that, but there are other groups and organisations in your locality with whom you will find affinities and with whom you can start that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
But I think it does link us back to official politics quite nicely. A lot of the movements that we've talked about, everything really, is linked to decisions that are taken in an official political space. And we've got so many crises that spring up. It seems to me that they're devastating, and it can be, you know, hard to know, like thinking about hardship in this country right now, that is going to spread. But it also provides opportunities perhaps for anarchists to organise. Is that the way you see it?
Well, I'd hope so, because I find it's scary actually to think about what's going on. I mean, you know, you hear already that food banks are running out of food. You know, so you know there is a question about, you know, how can you be proactive in thinking about how you might organise with people to help. And how, you know, that might take you into spaces that, you know, might be slightly uncomfortable in terms of the other people you work with, but nevertheless, I mean that's something. I mean, you know, there are all kinds of things that you can do. I mean, you know, in schools, if your kids are at school, you know, so how do you participate in those kinds of activities, and how do you raise your concerns about the curriculum, or I think there are all those avenues.
Just strikes me as a little bit ironic and a little bit worrying that our opportunities to anarchise things are coming through decisions made in official politics by politicians who clearly don't want to alleviate the problems which then ordinary people are going to have to kind of like solve and sort.
I suppose so, but I mean, part of the critique, isn't it, is that the existing system is unsustainable.
Yeah.
You know, it can't work in the long term, and you know, since 1945, I suppose people have thought, oh, but it has worked, and now they see it collapsing around them.
Yeah.
You know, and so where's that going to take us? Because it's difficult to see what the mechanisms are to stop a really dramatic rightward shift. And it's also really difficult to see how you can salvage much from a political system that's been designed to provide sufficient material well-being for enough people, and now it can't even do that. It's a really significant moment, I think.
Well, that's scary.
Yeah. And I guess like today the climate is, you know, in thinking is just so pessimistic, and so, you know, so what kind of language do you think, you know, anarchists should be using? I mean, optimism, hope, you know, playfulness. Like, I mean, it doesn't really kind of sit well. I think it can be like shrugged off like kind of cynically by a lot of people. Like, how do you think?
Well, mutual aid plays well, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah, that does. Yeah.
That play. You know, and that's we have a lot to say about that.
I think we also need to be realistic as well, don't we, about what the aims are of each movement that people get involved in. I think we might have missed the bus on preventing climate change, and a lot of the language around environmentalism is still about preventing climate change. Well, we're seeing it. We've got the hottest Britain on record, and we're sitting here in the second heat wave of the summer, and there might be another one after this, who knows. And it just seems like we should be moving towards the language of trying to mitigate against climate change as much as possible, rather than this idea that we might stop it completely, because I think
it's already happening?
Well, it is already happening, I agree. I think the language of sustainability is really dangerous. So the idea that that the answer to climate change lies in changing the basis of your energy. So you move from fossil fuel, but you don't change anything else. So we're still thinking that, your average middle class family will have at least one car, if not two, and we'll just run them all on electricity now, and that will be fine. Unless we start thinking about the kind of the behavioural changes to capitalism. That's what's going on here. Climate change is part of is the result of capitalist exploitation, unless you start pushing that home and you allow the language of sustainability to take over, then nothing else changes. And in a sense, I think there's a wider point about how you anarchise. So much as I think you can anarchise pretty much any institution, there's also a discussion to have about, if the idea is that you're collaborating with other people in order to help people meet their needs, then there are choices to be made about which institutions you want to preserve and why do we have this? Why is the world so complicated that we can't just take any single institution and make it better? We have to start simplifying things. If you can't run it, then don't do it.
Wow, it feels like a good place to stop. I don't know.
Yeah,
Is that about right?
Yeah.
If you can't run it, don't do it. Right, okay. Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
That was fun.
Unless there's anything
It's really
else
good fun.
anybody wants to say.
It's kind of...
That sounds good. Let's leave it there. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So that wraps up our first episode, a bumper episode, a little bit longer than we thought it would be, but useful discussions because they set the scene. Is that how you feel too, Shane?
Yeah, it starts the conversation that we're trying to have around anarchist politics, injecting an anarchist perspective into politics, into the biggest problems in society today.
So we've got a list of people we want to talk to as well, haven't we? And we've got future episodes in the pipeline, and we're hoping to get through some of those interviews soon. And so hopefully if people subscribe, they'll get this delivered to their inbox whenever the next episode comes out. And people can contact us. Again, what's the email address again?
alittlebiggeranarchism@gmail.com.
Excellent. So hopefully people have enjoyed it and people have got something out of it. It is just the start, and hopefully people will listen again next time.
Yeah, until then, that's bye from me.
Cheers. Bye-bye.